Hello everybody, I'm Sniping is Fun, and I want to welcome you back to my looking back on the Smash Brothers series set of videos that I've been doing recently. I'm sorry that I didn't do the Brawl one anytime sooner after I did the original Melee. I was kind of busy for a short time there, so I really couldn't do it, but now it's here. This is of course going to be the third part in the series in which I look back on Super Smash Bros. Melee on the Nintendo Wii, and I look back on its roster selection, what systems it was based off of, and the reasons why certain characters were the reasons those certain new characters were included in this game over, let's say, other characters. But before I get into talking actually about Super Smash Bros. Brawl, I want to go back and talk about one quick little thing I forgot to talk about Melee when I did part 2, about a certain trend that actually affected a certain amount of those newcomers that actually came to the roster in Melee. And I forgot to mention about the clone reasons, because a certain number of characters, the newcomers actually in Super Smash Bros. Melee, actually had similar movesets to their certain other characters on the roster, like Dr. Mario to Mario, or Roy to Marth, or Young Link to Adult Link, or Pichu to Pikachu, that kind of thing, and even Falco the Fox. When they did this, it was like, I think they wanted to try to find characters that were recent enough on the recent systems, Super Smash Bros. Melee's roster mainly being based off the Nintendo 64, the Game Boy Color, and the Game Boy Advance. So they had those recent reasons to include these characters, to look at those systems and look into these franchises in order to get those characters. But they also, for a few characters, because they wanted to probably add more characters to the roster than probably what was probably expected at the time, because Melee got 13 newcomers, so they probably didn't maybe plan on making that much of newcomers, 13 to the roster originally. But then they looked into these characters that have similar movesets to people already on the roster from the original, or people that were added into Melee, so they could probably much use that same moveset for another character being added into Melee, to actually include them in the game and have their, to be able to use that for character inclusion when it comes to moveset, potential. So all this stuff about it being on the N64, Game Boy Color, and the Game Boy Advance, the recent reasons, those all come to effect more so than the clone reason. But the clone reason does come into effect on a certain amount of characters, because it was the team wanting to get more characters out than they possibly could, but they took the easy way out, per se, in quotations, in order to get more characters in there. But they still were recent inclusions to the series, like second generation Pokemon, or newer stuff, the similar Star Fox characters, or the recent Fire Emblem, or stuff like that. But that's all I'm saying. I just forgot to mention that in part 2 when I was talking about Super Smash Bros. Melee on the GameCube. I wanted to pick that up quickly here and let you guys, and tell you guys now, so I could let you guys know something I forgot about the last part, and that's it. And now that's out of the way, we can finally move on to Super Smash Bros. Brawl. And before I actually get onto the actual roster, returning characters, and the newcomers, I want to talk about what systems Super Smash Bros. Brawl was actually mainly based off of. And if you have recently seen part 1 with the 64 game and part 2 of Melee, you will kind of get a similar picture with this one. Super Smash Bros. Brawl's roster was mainly based off 3 systems as well: the Nintendo GameCube, the Nintendo Game Boy Advance, and the Nintendo DS. Smash Bros. Games tend to be based off the previous generation, and since this game was released on the Wii, the previous generation would have been the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube. And usually the handheld, or even, let's say, even the console sometimes, like the current generation console and current generation handheld, can be included into that equation if the Smash Brothers game is actually released far enough into those consoles in order to be able to grab anything from there. Now, at this point, the DS was about 4 years old, or about 3.5, 4 years old, when Brawl was released. So they had an ample amount of time to actually grab some stuff from the DS, and they did. So that's the reason why the DS actually came into play on here in terms of roster. The Wii was only about 2 years old, and it had some things about the system on there, but for the roster, for the Wii, But most of the roster was Game Boy Advance, GameCube, and the DS. But there was a little bit of Wii representation there, not enough for me to actually include. So that's the reason why it's not included in the picture, but it was just a tiny little bit. The Wii is not the system to actually be represented in a Smash Bros. Game yet, so it's fine if it's not here in Brawl yet, you know, that kind of thing. But like I said, Super Smash Bros. Brawl was based off the GameCube, Game Boy Advance, and the Nintendo DS. The DS was out long enough for it to actually be represented in the game. Obviously, the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube were previous generation, and the Wii wasn't out long enough to actually get much of representation, if any really at all, in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. And then that's it. And that's what the Super Smash Bros. Roster was mainly based off, was that. Now, before I move on to the newcomers, just like I did in the Melee one, I'm going to talk about the returning characters. Now, we all know the original 12 were going to stay in there. They were the original 12 in the original Smash Brothers, and they stayed all in, you know, Melee, most of which had recent games at the time. In Melee's case, the only characters from the returning roster that did not have games recently on the systems it was based off of were Samus and Ness, because there was no Earthbound game on, or Earthbound/Mother game on Game Boy Color or the Nintendo 64, although there was planned, Mother 3 was planned to be on the Nintendo 64, but it didn't come out until the Game Boy Advance. And there were no Game Boy Color or, you know, Nintendo 64 Metroid games, so Samus wasn't recent either, but they returned because it's kind of in common practice now in the Smash Bros. Series that the original 12 stay around. Samus being from the Metroid series, which is one of Nintendo's biggest franchises, and Ness being from the Mother/Earthbound series, which is still pretty popular. People still know it, especially in Japan, and he was returning because of just the whole point, like that Ness came back because of the whole point. You know, he was a returning character. You know, he was there. And all the other ones basically had N64, Game Boy Color, and even early Game Boy Advance games kind of thing to be included in that roster. And the original 12 do return here in Brawl, all 12 of them, and most of them do come from recent games, so besides being part of the original 12, they do have recent games at the time that they were there because of Mario, because of Mario Sunshine, Luigi because of Luigi's Mansion, Peach and Bowser basically because of Mario Sunshine, as well as like the Mario Sports games and Mario Party games that were all over the GameCube and the Game Boy Advance, and the, you know, Mario games and all that. Link basically had Twilight Princess, Zelda had Twilight Princess, Ganondorf had Twilight Princess, Donkey Kong had all the Jungle Beat and Conga games and all that on the GameCube, and the remakes of the country games on the Game Boy Advance. Captain Falcon had F-Zero GX. Yoshi was basically always, I think Yoshi was in Mario Sunshine, I think, as well. There was Star Fox Adventures and Star Fox Assault on the GameCube, among like the other, in the Pokemon games. They had Coliseum, they had XD Gala Darkness, they had like all like the Gen 3 and the remakes of Gen 1 on the Game Boy Advance, you know, stuff like that. The majority of the 12 original characters did have games on the previous generation, the GameCube and the Game Boy Advance, but and that was the reason why they were included, outside the fact that they were the original 12. The only character from the original 12 that did not have a game this time was Ness. Metroid was able to get a game for this time because they got Metroid Prime 1 and 2, and even then 3 technically, because an early like Wii reason for why Samus was there, but it was mainly because of Prime 1 and Prime 2. But all the original 12 had games on the previous generation system at this time, the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube. besides NES. But NES came back because of the original. All of them came back because of the original 12 reason, but they all came back because they had games too. And characters from Melee that were included in Melee came back as well. Falco came back because of the Star Fox games on GameCube. Peach returns, Bowser returns, Ganondorf and Zelda return, Marth returns, Ice Climbers return, Game & Watch returns. You know, all the majority of the characters from Melee come back, either because they're still, like, in terms of, let's say, Ice Climbers or Game & Watch retro reasons, or they did have games at the time. And Marth was still technically a Japanese retro character at the time because there was no new game with him yet at the time. From Melee to Brawl, 5 characters were replaced. 5 characters. Those being Dr. Mario, Pichu, Roy, Mewtwo, and that was the last one, Young Link. Those were the 5 that were either they were taken out completely or replaced with another character when it came to the Brawl roster. So they were taken out or replaced with someone else, kind of thing. So they did not return for various reasons. They might not have had a recent game at the time, or they didn't want to do the whole clone character thing, and they didn't feel like probably updating their movesets or stuff like that. And there you go. And now that's talking about the characters returning in the original 12, and basically characters that were in previous Smash Bros. Games that came into Brawl. Now I'm going to start talking about the newcomers that actually came into Smash Brothers. And the first character I'm actually going to start talking about is going to be Diddy Kong from the Donkey Kong series. Now, since the beginning, Donkey Kong was the only character that represented his series in the original and in Melee. This one, he finally gets another character from the series, Diddy Kong, who is pretty much the second most popular and second most necessary, important character in the Donkey Kong franchise. And the reasons why he was included, besides being second to Donkey Kong being one of the most important characters in the Donkey Kong series, is because recently he had games that he was on, that he was in on the previous generation. He was in Jungle Beat on the GameCube, as well as I think all 3 Donkey Konga games on the GameCube. And there were like Donkey Kong Country 1, 2, and 3 remakes on the Game Boy Advance. And even though he had no part in Part 3, he was there in the first 2, and he technically represents the Country series, basically, with or without Donkey Kong, because he's in 2 of the 3 Donkey Kong Country games at this time. And he's just like an important character, you know, to the series, like I said. So it was natural for, you know, Diddy Kong to be the next Donkey Kong character, because he's such an important role there alongside Donkey Kong, and he's pretty much the most important one underneath it, and he's also a popular character, so it's enough to warrant him, outside the fact that he was still recent, you know, on the previous generation systems at the time. The next character I'm going to talk about will be Wario. Now, Wario has history with Nintendo. He's a long-time Nintendo character. He's been around since like the Game Boy, original Game Boy, with the Super Mario Land 2 and the 6 gold coins. He was like the villain in that game, and he's been around since then. So he could have easily been in the original, and possibly even the Melee, but he was not included till Brawl. And outside the fact that he's a long-time Nintendo character, the reason why he really was such an important character to include in Brawl was because the previous generation of GameCube and GameCube and Game Boy Advance, was because he was all over there, basically. Like, when the GameCube launched, there was Wario Land. I don't think it was a direct launch, but it was like shortly thereafter. There was a Wario Land game that he was on. Later in the GameCube's lifetime, there was a WarioWare game, and I think there might have been 1 or 2 WarioWare games on the Game Boy Advance as well. So he was all over the GameCube and Game Boy Advance generation. So it was, besides the fact that he's a long-time Nintendo character and has history with them, in which he pretty much could have been included in the older games if they really wanted to include him, they brought him in and included him in this one because of how much of a prominent role he played on the GameCube and Game Boy Advance. Outside of those facts, he was also in this.